"Why do you look so upset?" the little girl asked the single dad. And then what her mom did changed everything. Before we continue, please tell us, where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. Grant Hudson was sitting on a weathered park bench in the Fairmount section of Philadelphia on a Thursday evening in early October, watching the sun drop behind the row houses across the street. And he was pretty sure he looked exactly like what he was. A guy who just spent 45 minutes getting lectured by his ex-wife about all the ways he was screwing up their 7-year-old son. The park was one of those neighborhood spots that wasn't fancy or Instagram-worthy, just a couple of swings and a rusty slide, and some patchy grass where kids played soccer until their parents called them in for dinner. And normally Grant would have headed straight home after a meeting with Lisa, but he couldn't face his empty apartment yet, knowing Noah was at her place for the night, probably telling her all the reasons Dad was boring and no fun anymore. The thing about being a middle school history teacher is you spend all day managing other people's kids, and then you come home and realize you have no idea how to connect with your own. And Grant had been living that irony for the past 6 months, watching Noah pull further away every single week. His son's second-grade teacher had called him in last Friday saying Noah was acting out in class, not listening, getting into arguments with other kids over nothing. And when Grant tried to talk to him about it, Noah had just shrugged and said, "I don't know," in that tone that really meant, "I don't want to talk to you about it." Lisa had texted him Sunday night saying they needed to meet to discuss Noah's behavior, and Grant had shown up at the coffee shop near her place this afternoon, thinking maybe they could actually co-parent like adults for once. But instead, he'd gotten 30 minutes of her listing everything he was doing wrong. According to Lisa, Grant was too strict about homework, not strict enough about bedtime. Didn't take Noah to enough activities, took him to too many activities that Grant wanted instead of what Noah wanted. And the kicker was when she'd said, "He told me you don't smile anymore, Grant." Kids notice that stuff, and it affects them. He'd wanted to say, yeah, well, divorce does that to a person, especially when your wife leaves you for her coworker and blows up your entire life. But he just nodded and said he'd work on it, because what else are you supposed to say when your ex-wife is probably right? So here he was on a park bench at 6:30 on a random Thursday, looking like somebody had just told him his dog died, which he didn't even have a dog, so that would have been extra depressing, just staring at nothing and trying to figure out where he'd lost the plot with his own kid. Grant didn't notice the little girl walking toward him until she was standing directly in front of the bench with her head tilted to one side like she was studying a museum exhibit. And when he looked down, she had these huge brown eyes and curly hair in 2 pom-pom ponytails, and she was maybe 5 years old wearing a jacket with dinosaurs all over it. "Why do you look so upset?" she asked in that completely straightforward way little kids have before they learn that adults don't always want to answer personal questions from strangers. And Grant was so caught off guard, he actually laughed, which came out more like a surprise bark than actual humor. Before he could figure out how to respond, he heard a woman's voice calling, "Ruby, honey, come back here. We don't bother people sitting alone." And Grant looked up to see a woman speed walking toward them with an apologetic expression already forming on her face. The woman reached the bench slightly out of breath and put her hand on the little girl's shoulder. "I'm so sorry. She has absolutely zero sense of stranger danger and apparently thinks everyone needs a welfare check." Grant shook his head and surprised himself by actually smiling for real this time. "No, it's okay. She just startled me. I was pretty deep in my own head." The little girl, Ruby apparently, was not deterred by her mom's attempt to redirect her and looked up at Grant with total seriousness. "Did you lose your favorite toy?" "That's why I get upset sometimes, or when I can't have ice cream. But Mama says we can't have ice cream every day, even though I don't understand why not." Grant felt something loosen in his chest, and he looked at this tiny person who just compared his entire mess of a life to losing a toy, and somehow that made it feel less heavy for a second. "Something like that," he said, and his voice came out less rough than it had been. "I'm just having a tough day, but thank you for checking on me. That's really nice of you." Ruby nodded like this made perfect sense and then announced, "Mama says be nice to sad people, so I'm being nice." The woman, Ruby's mom, looked mortified and said, "Okay, sweetheart, that's enough profound wisdom for one evening. Let's let this man have his bench back." But she was smiling when she said it, and Grant could tell she wasn't actually mad, just mildly embarrassed by her kid's lack of filter. Grant looked at the woman properly for the first time and noticed she had the kind of face that seemed like it smiled a lot. Laugh lines around her eyes, wearing jeans and a nonprofit organization hoodie that said Philadelphia Youth Alliance. And she was watching her daughter with this mix of exasperation and pride that he recognized from his own parenting. "She's fine, really," Grant said and meant it. "This is actually the first normal conversation I've had all day, which is kind of sad when you think about it. But here we are." The woman hesitated for a second and then made a decision that Grant would think about for the next 3 days straight. She sat down on the other end of the bench, keeping a respectful distance, and said, "Ruby has this radar for people having bad days. I swear she can sense emotional distress from like 50 feet away. I'm Mary, by the way. Well, Meredith, but everyone calls me Mary." Grant introduced himself and shook her hand, which felt weirdly formal given that her daughter had just diagnosed his emotional state within 30 seconds of meeting him. And Ruby had gotten distracted by a stick on the ground and was poking at something in the grass a few feet away. Mary glanced at her daughter to make sure she wasn't eating dirt or something equally likely for a 5-year-old, and then said, "I don't mean to pry, and you can absolutely tell me to mind my business, but you look like you could use something to take your mind off whatever's weighing on you." Grant let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "Is it that obvious?" And Mary gave him a sympathetic look. "You've got that 1,000-yard stare thing happening. I see it a lot in my line of work. I run programs for a youth center, and parents come in looking exactly like you do right now, like they're one load of laundry away from a breakdown." That should have felt insulting, but somehow it didn't. Maybe because she said it without pity, just straight observation. And Grant found himself saying, "My ex-wife just spent the better part of an hour telling me I'm failing our 7-year-old son, and the worst part is she's probably right. I teach middle school, so I'm around kids all day, but I can't figure out how to connect with my own kid anymore." He had no idea why he was telling this complete stranger his business, but something about sitting on a park bench at dusk with her weird, empathetic daughter poking sticks nearby made it feel safe to just say it out loud. Mary nodded like this made total sense. Divorce is brutal on everyone, and being a good teacher doesn't automatically make you a perfect parent. Those are different skill sets. Plus, your kid's grieving too, even if he can't articulate it. 7-year-olds don't have the vocabulary for that kind of loss. Grant looked at her and felt seen in a way he hadn't in months. Not judged, just understood, and he said, "How do you know so much about this?" Mary smiled. "Hazards of the job. I spend 40 hours a week running after-school programs and weekend activities for kids whose parents are struggling. You pick up patterns. Also, I've got Ruby and I'm doing the single mom thing, so I get the whole feeling like you're winging it and hoping you don't screw them up too badly." Grant was about to ask if Ruby's dad was in the picture when Mary stood up and called Ruby back over. "Okay, Bug, we need to get home for dinner before you turn into a gremlin." And Ruby ran over and grabbed her mom's hand, but looked back at Grant. "I hope you feel better, mister. Maybe you'll find your toy." Mary laughed and ruffled her daughter's hair, and then she did something Grant didn't expect. She pulled a flyer out of her jacket pocket and handed it to him. "We're doing a community movie night in this park on Saturday evening. Just neighbors and families. We project a kids' movie on a sheet and hand out popcorn. It's super low-key, but it might be a good distraction. No pressure, obviously, but if you want to bring your son, it's free and completely judgment-free zone." Grant took the flyer and stared at it. Some animated movie he vaguely recognized. Start time 7 p.m., and when he looked up, Mary was already walking toward the park exit, with Ruby skipping beside her chattering about something. He called after them, and Mary turned and waved. "Hope to see you Saturday, Grant." And then they were gone around the corner, and he was alone on the bench again, but somehow it felt different than it had 20 minutes ago. Grant sat there until the streetlights came on, holding that flyer, and thinking about how a 5-year-old's blunt question had cracked something open in him that had been sealed shut for months, and how her mom had offered him exactly what he needed, which wasn't advice or pity, just a simple invitation to show up somewhere and be around other people. He folded the flyer carefully and put it in his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone and stared at it for a full minute before texting his ex-wife, "Can I pick up Noah Saturday afternoon?" Want to try something different with him? And Lisa wrote back almost immediately, "Sure, what's the plan?" Grant typed and deleted 3 different responses before finally settling on taking him to a community thing, trying to be less boring, and she sent back a thumbs up, which was probably the most positive interaction they'd had in 6 months. He drove home to his quiet apartment in West Philly and made himself a sandwich he barely tasted. And before he went to bed, he looked at that flyer one more time and thought maybe there was a chance he could figure out how to smile again. And maybe his kid would notice. Grant showed up at the park on Saturday evening with Noah dragging his feet beside him and complaining for the 3rd time in 10 minutes that he didn't want to watch some baby movie with a bunch of random kids. And Grant was about 2 seconds away from turning around and going home when he spotted Mary setting up folding chairs near the makeshift screen that was basically just a white sheet strung between 2 trees. Noah had his arms crossed doing that thing 7-year-olds do, where they make their entire body language scream, "I'm being forced to be here against my will." And Grant was seriously questioning whether this was a good idea or just another thing Lisa would add to her list of his parenting failures. He was about to suggest they could leave when Ruby came tearing across the grass at full speed and skidded to a stop right in front of them. "You came, Mama said maybe you would, and I said you would because you lost your toy and needed to find it." And Grant had absolutely no idea how to respond to that. Mary jogged over, looking slightly winded, and gave Grant this warm smile that made his stomach do something he wasn't ready to examine too closely. "Hey, you actually showed up. I wasn't sure if you'd come." And Grant shrugged, trying to play it cool even though he'd changed his shirt 3 times before leaving the house like some kind of teenager. "Figured it was worth a shot. This is my son Noah." And he put his hand on Noah's shoulder, but his kid just stood there, staring at the ground, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Ruby didn't seem bothered by Noah's complete lack of enthusiasm and announced, "I'm Ruby, and I'm 5 3/4, and I like your shoes," which were just regular sneakers but apparently worthy of compliment in Ruby's world. Mary gave Grant this look that said, "Kids are weird," and gestured toward the chairs. "Movie starts in about 15 minutes. Grab a seat wherever. Popcorn's free, and there's juice boxes in that cooler. Very fancy operation we're running here." They ended up sitting near the middle, and Noah immediately pulled out the handheld game console Grant had let him bring as a bribe. And Grant felt like a failure for needing to bribe his kid to spend time with him. But here they were. Mary sat down in the chair next to Grant's with Ruby bouncing on her lap, and the park started filling up with families and the noise level went from quiet to chaotic in about 90 seconds flat. "So how's your week been since Thursday?" Mary asked while wrestling Ruby into actually sitting still, and Grant was surprised she remembered it had been Thursday and that she was asking like she actually wanted to know. "Honestly, pretty much the same. Work was fine. Noah's still not really talking to me about anything that matters. I'm still trying to figure out what I'm doing wrong." And he hadn't meant to be that honest, but something about Mary made him want to skip the small talk and just say real things. Mary glanced at Noah, who was completely absorbed in his game, and lowered her voice. "Can I ask you something, and you can tell me if I'm overstepping?" Grant nodded, and she continued. "Does he know you're struggling too? Like, have you actually told him that you're trying to figure this out together instead of pretending you've got it all handled?" Grant felt that question land in his chest. "I don't want to put that on him. He's 7. He shouldn't have to worry about whether his dad's okay." Mary's expression got thoughtful. "Maybe, but kids aren't stupid. They can tell when adults are faking it, and sometimes knowing you're both trying to figure it out makes them feel less alone. I don't know, I could be completely wrong." The movie started before Grant could respond, and he sat there in the dark thinking about what she'd said while some animated penguins sang a song about friendship. Halfway through the movie, Ruby got down from Mary's lap and walked over to Noah, and Grant watched his son look up from his game with this annoyed expression that immediately softened when Ruby whispered something in his ear. Noah actually smiled, a real smile, not the fake one he gave adults, and put his game down to watch the movie with Ruby sitting cross-legged on the grass in front of his chair, pointing at the screen and asking questions that Noah answered with surprising patience. Grant felt his throat get tight watching his kid be gentle with this little girl when he'd been nothing but attitude all week, and Mary leaned over and whispered, "She's got a gift for getting through to people. No idea where she gets it from because I'm awkward as hell." Grant laughed quietly. You're not awkward. You're the person who invites random sad guys on park benches to movie nights. That's like the opposite of awkward. And Mary bumped his shoulder with hers. Okay, fair point. I'm aggressively friendly, which is probably its own kind of weird. After the movie ended and people started packing up their chairs, Grant helped Mary break down the equipment, even though she insisted he didn't have to. And Noah was showing Ruby how to beat some level on his game, while both kids sat on the grass, completely engrossed. This was really nice, Grant said while folding up the projection screen. I haven't seen Noah smile like that in a while, so thank you. Mary handed him another chair to stack. Well, if you want to see more of that smile, we run programs at the youth center on weekends. It's basically organized chaos, but we're always looking for parent volunteers. And the kids who come are mostly between 4 and 8, so Noah would fit right in. He could help with the younger ones if he wanted. Grant paused mid-fold. You think he'd actually go for that? And Mary shrugged. Only one way to find out. But in my experience, kids respond really well to being given responsibility, makes them feel important. That's how Grant ended up bringing Noah to the Philadelphia Youth Alliance Center the following Saturday. And his son had been skeptical right up until they walked in and saw a group of 4 and 5-year-olds building a fort out of cardboard boxes. Mary had put Noah in charge of the art station, which was just a table covered in markers and construction paper. And Grant watched his kid show a tiny girl with pigtails how to draw a cat and felt something shift in his chest because this was the Noah he remembered before the divorce turned everything sideways. He and Mary ended up in the small kitchen area, making juice boxes happen for 20 kids. And she told him about how she'd gotten into nonprofit work after spending her 20s doing corporate event planning and hating every second of it. I wanted to do something that actually mattered, she said while opening her 4th pack of juice boxes. And then I had Ruby and realized I wanted her to see me doing work I believed in. I know that sounds cheesy, but it's true. Grant asked the question that had been nagging at him for 2 weeks. Ruby's dad, is he in the picture or is that too personal? And Mary didn't flinch, just kept opening juice boxes. Donor situation, I did the whole thing solo by choice. I was 31 and single and wanted a kid and didn't want to wait around for the perfect partner who might never show up. Best decision I ever made, even though everyone in my family thought I was having a crisis. Grant felt his respect for her multiply by about 1,000. That's incredibly brave. I can barely handle single parenting after having a partner for the first 6 years. I can't imagine doing it from day one. Mary smiled at him. You give yourself way too little credit. You're showing up for your kid even when it's hard. That's like 90% of parenting right there. They fell into this routine over the next month where Grant and Noah would show up at the youth center on Saturdays, and Noah would help with the younger kids while Grant and Mary worked side by side doing whatever needed doing, and then after the program ended, they'd grab coffee at the place 2 blocks down while the kids played at the small park next door. Grant started noticing things like how Mary took her coffee with way too much sugar and how she always wore mismatched socks and how she laughed at his terrible history teacher jokes that nobody else found funny. One Saturday in late October, they were sitting on a bench watching Noah push Ruby on the swings, and Mary said something that made Grant's brain short-circuit. I haven't been on a date since before Ruby was born. Like genuinely haven't even wanted to. I've been perfectly happy just doing the mom thing. But lately I've been thinking maybe I've been using her as an excuse to not put myself out there. Grant's heart started doing something irregular, and he tried to keep his voice normal. Why lately? And Mary gave him this look that made it very clear she knew exactly what she was doing. I don't know, maybe I met someone who reminded me that adult conversation is actually nice, and that being a mom doesn't mean turning off the part of me that might want something for myself too. Grant was trying to formulate a response that didn't sound completely ridiculous when his phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out to see a text from Lisa that said, Noah told me you've been spending weekends with some woman and her daughter. Are you dating someone? We should probably discuss that. Grant felt his stomach drop, and Mary must have seen his face change, because she asked, everything okay? And he showed her the text without thinking about it. Mary read it and handed his phone back carefully. That's fair, she's his mom. She should know what's going on in his life. And her voice had this forced casual tone that Grant recognized as hurt trying to sound unbothered. There's nothing to tell her, Grant said, and then realized how that sounded. I mean, we're not. We haven't. I'm not dating anyone. And Mary's expression did something complicated. Right, yeah, we're just friends who hang out every weekend. Totally normal. And she wasn't being mean, but Grant could tell he'd stepped in it somehow. They finished their coffee in awkward silence. And when Grant picked Noah up from the swings, his son looked at him and said, "Why does your face look weird?" Which was exactly the kind of observation he didn't need right then. That night after dropping Noah off at Lisa's place, Grant got a call from his ex-wife, and she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Noah says there's a lady named Mary and her daughter Ruby, and you all hang out on Saturdays. What's going on, Grant?" He tried to explain about the youth center and the volunteering and how Noah was actually doing better, but Lisa cut him off. "Are you dating her?" And Grant said, "No, we're friends." And Lisa's silence on the other end spoke volumes. Finally, she said, "Noah told me you smile when you talk about her, and look, I don't care if you date someone, but you need to be careful about bringing women around our son. He's already dealing with enough changes." Grant felt defensive even though she wasn't wrong. "I'm not bringing random women around him. Mary runs a youth program that's been good for him. That's it." But after he hung up, Grant couldn't stop thinking about what Lisa had said and what Noah must have told her. And the next day at school, one of his students asked him why he seemed distracted, and he realized he was thinking about Mary in the middle of teaching the Revolutionary War. When Noah came over that Wednesday for his midweek night, Grant tried to talk to him about the youth center and Mary, and whether it bothered him that they'd been hanging out, and Noah just shrugged and said, "I don't care," in that tone that meant he definitely cared but didn't want to talk about it. Then Thursday morning, Grant got a call from Noah's teacher saying his son had gotten into a fight at recess. Nothing major but completely unlike him. And when Grant picked Noah up and asked about it, his kid exploded in a way he hadn't since the early divorce days. "You like them more than me. You don't even want me anymore," Noah shouted with tears streaming down his face. And Grant felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. "That's not true, buddy. That's not what's happening." But Noah wasn't listening. "Mom said you smile at Mary, and Ruby's nice and little, and not mad all the time like me, so you probably want her instead." Grant tried to hug him, but Noah pulled away and ran to his room, and Grant stood in his living room, feeling like the worst father on planet Earth. He texted Mary that night saying, "I need to focus on Noah for a while. Things are complicated, I'm sorry." And she wrote back, "I understand. Take care of your son. I'm here if you need anything." And Grant felt the loss of her before he'd even really had her. 2 weeks went by, and Grant threw himself into being present for Noah. And his son slowly started talking to him again, but kept asking, "Are you still friends with Miss Mary?" in this small voice that made Grant's heart hurt. Mary sent an email mentioning Ruby's Important People Day at her kindergarten, and he deleted it without reading fully because that wasn't his life anymore. He'd made his choice, and it was the right one, even if it felt completely wrong. Grant spent 2 weeks trying to convince himself he'd made the right call, putting distance between himself and Mary. And every single day, Noah would ask in this careful voice, "Are we going to the youth center this Saturday?" And Grant would have to say no and watch his kid's face fall. And by the end of week 2, he was starting to think maybe he'd made the wrong choice for the right reasons, which was somehow worse than just screwing up completely. He was grading papers at his desk after school on a Thursday in mid-November when there was a knock on his classroom door, and when he looked up, Mary was there, found via volunteer forms, looking nervous in a way he'd never seen her before. And his heart did this stupid leap thing that proved he'd been lying to himself about just wanting to focus on his son. "Hey," she said from the doorway, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to come in, and Grant stood up so fast he knocked a stack of papers onto the floor. "Hey, what are you doing here? Is everything okay?" And Mary walked in a few steps and tucked her hair behind her ear, which he'd learned was what she did when she was working up courage to say something. "Ruby's kindergarten is doing this thing next week called Important People Day, where kids invite adults who are important to them. And she asked her teacher if Mr. Grant could come, because, and I'm quoting here, he needs to see he's important." And Mary's voice cracked just slightly on the last word. Grant felt his throat get tight, and he sat down on the edge of his desk. "She asked for me?" And Mary nodded. "I wasn't going to tell you because I know you need space for Noah. But then I thought about what I'd want someone to do for Ruby if she asked for them, and I decided to show up and ask even if you say no." Grant ran his hand through his hair, and tried to organize the mess of feelings happening in his chest. I can't. Mary Noah's in a really fragile place right now. He thinks I'm trying to replace him with you and Ruby. I can't just show up at your daughter's school thing when I'm trying to prove to my kid he's my priority. Mary was quiet for a second, and then she did something that reminded Grant why he'd been drawn to her in the first place. She gently pushed back without making him feel like garbage. Can I say something, and you can tell me if I'm out of line? And Grant nodded, so she continued. Maybe Noah needs to see you showing up for people, not just managing him or fixing him. Kids learn by watching, and if he sees you being someone a 5-year-old thinks is important, maybe he'll understand you can be his dad and still be a person who cares about other people. That hit Grant like a truck because he'd been so focused on proving to Noah he was enough that he hadn't considered he might be teaching his kid the wrong lesson. That love was finite, and you had to choose one person over everyone else. I don't know if bringing him to Ruby's school is the best idea, Grant said, but his resolve was cracking, and Mary took another step closer. Then don't bring him. Just come yourself if that's easier. But Grant, she asked for you specifically, and I think there's a reason. She saw something in you that first night that made her want to check on you, and maybe you showing up for her would teach both our kids something about how people can matter to each other. Grant looked at this woman who'd somehow become essential to his life in less than 2 months. You really think I should come? And Mary smiled. I think Ruby's smarter than both of us combined, and we should probably listen to her. Grant went home that night, did something he should have done weeks ago. He sat Noah down at the kitchen table and had an actual honest conversation instead of just trying to manage his feelings. Buddy, I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear me, okay? And Noah looked up from his pizza with suspicious eyes but nodded. Grant took a breath. Miss Mary invited me to Ruby's Important People Day at her school, and I wanted to ask you how you'd feel about that before I decided anything. Noah's face did something complicated, and he put down his pizza. Why does Ruby think you're important? You barely know her. And his voice had that edge that meant he was protecting himself. Grant chose his words carefully. Remember that first night at the park when Ruby asked me why I looked upset? I was having a really bad day, feeling like I was failing you, and she made me smile for the first time in weeks. And then her mom invited us to the movie night, and I got to watch you be amazing with Ruby, helping her and making her laugh. And I realized I'd forgotten what it looked like when you were happy. Noah was quiet for a minute and then said in this small voice, I thought you liked them better than me. And Grant felt his heart crack. Noah, look at me. And his son looked up with wet eyes. There is nothing and nobody on this planet more important to me than you. But here's the thing I'm learning. Me being happy doesn't take anything away from you. Actually, it probably makes me a better dad because I'm not just sad and stressed all the time. Noah wiped his eyes with his sleeve. Do you like Miss Mary? Like more than friends? And Grant decided honesty was the only move here. Yeah, buddy, I do. Does that bother you? Noah shrugged. Ruby's annoying, but she's kind of funny, and you do smile more when you talk about them. And I heard Mom tell Grandma you seemed lighter, whatever that means. Grant made a decision that was either brilliant or completely reckless. How would you feel about coming with me to Ruby's school thing? You don't have to, but I think she'd be excited to see you too. Noah thought about it for way longer than Grant expected, and then said, okay, but if it's weird, we're leaving. And Grant laughed. Deal. If it's weird, we bail immediately. The following week, pre-cleared by Mary, Grant and Noah showed up at Ruby's classroom decorated with construction paper flowers and student artwork, and the room was packed with parents and grandparents and people who clearly meant something to these 5- and 6-year-olds. Ruby spotted them the second they walked in, and her entire face lit up like someone had plugged her into an electrical socket. And she came running over and grabbed Grant's hand. You came. Mama said maybe you would, but I knew you would, because you needed to know you're important. She dragged Grant to the front of the room, where there was a chair with his name on a paper sign that was decorated with stickers and extremely wobbly letters. And Noah followed behind, looking around at all the kids and their important people with this interested expression. The teacher had each kid introduce their important person and say why they picked them. And when it was Ruby's turn, she stood up in front of everyone and pointed at Grant. This is Mr. Grant, and he's my friend. who was sad but smiles now. I met him at the park and asked him why he was upset. And then he came to movie night and now he's happy. Mama says sometimes people just need someone to notice them, and I noticed him. Grant had to blink really hard to keep from crying in a room full of kindergartners. And when he looked over at Mary, who was standing against the wall, she was definitely crying and not bothering to hide it. After the presentations were done and the kids got cookies that turned them all into sugar-fueled chaos, Noah pulled Grant aside near the coat hooks. "Ruby really thinks you're important, huh?" And Grant nodded. "Apparently so. Pretty cool, right?" Noah was quiet and then said, "You looked different when she was talking about you. Like you weren't sad dad. You were just regular dad." And Grant had no idea 7-year-olds were that observant. They left the school and Grant offered to buy Noah ice cream, even though it was 4 in the afternoon and would ruin dinner. And while they were sitting in the booth at the ice cream place, Noah asked, "So are you going to ask Miss Mary to be your girlfriend or what?" And Grant nearly choked on his cone. "I don't know, buddy. Would that be okay with you?" And Noah shrugged in that way kids do when they're trying to act casual about something that matters. "I guess Ruby's kind of silly, but she makes you laugh, and you don't look sad anymore when we hang out with them. So yeah, it's okay." Grant texted Mary that night after Noah went to bed. "Thank you for pushing me to come today. Ruby's right about a lot of things, including the fact that I smile more because of you two. Can we talk soon?" And Mary responded within seconds. "Tomorrow night. I can get a sitter. We could actually have a conversation without kids interrupting every 30 seconds." And Grant felt nervous and excited in a way he hadn't since he was a teenager. They met at a quiet restaurant in Fishtown, and for the first time since they'd met, they were just two adults sitting across from each other without the safety net of their kids as buffers. And Grant reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm sorry I pulled away. I was scared of screwing up with Noah again, and I thought the only way to fix it was to choose between you and him. But he helped me understand that's not how it works." Mary squeezed his hand. "I get it. Being a parent means they come first. I would have done the same thing if Ruby needed me to." And Grant shook his head. "But that's the thing. Noah didn't need me to cut you out. He needed me to be honest with him about what was happening and let him have a say. And when I actually did that, he was okay with it. Better than okay, actually." They talked for 2 hours about what it would look like to actually date while parenting and taking things slow so the kids could adjust. And when Grant walked Mary to her car, he kissed her for the first time, and it felt like something clicking into place that he hadn't even known was out of alignment. 5 months went by, and Grant and Mary figured out how to blend their lives without forcing it. Sunday dinners became a regular thing where Noah would teach Ruby increasingly complicated handshake routines, and the adults would cook together and pretend they knew what they were doing. Noah's teacher called Grant in February to tell him his son had done a complete turnaround, participating in class, making friends. And when Grant asked Noah what changed, his kid said, "I don't know. I'm just not mad anymore. Things are better now." One Saturday in early May, Grant suggested they all go back to the park where this whole thing started, and they ended up at the same bench where Ruby had first asked her question 7 months ago. Ruby climbed up on the bench next to Grant and looked at him with those serious brown eyes. "Are you still upset, Mr. Grant? Did you find your toy?" And Grant pulled her into a side hug. "No, Ruby, I'm not upset anymore. And I did find something I lost. I found out how to be happy again. Thank you for asking me that question." Noah was pushing Ruby on the swings a few minutes later, and Mary leaned against Grant's shoulder. "That little girl changed both our lives by being nosy at exactly the right moment," and Grant kissed the top of her head. "Best nosiness that ever happened to me." Sometimes healing doesn't start with big dramatic moments or perfect timing. Sometimes it starts with a 5-year-old asking why you look sad, and her mom deciding you're worth inviting to a movie night. Grant had thought he needed to choose between being a good dad and having his own life. But Ruby and Mary taught him that showing up for people and letting them show up for you is actually what makes you whole. If this story reminded you that simple kindness from unexpected people can change everything, and that kids see things adults miss when we're too stuck in our own heads, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to remember that healing is possible. Drop a comment about where you're watching from and tell us about a time a stranger's kindness changed your day. We love hearing your stories. Thanks for being here with us. And remember, sometimes the best thing you can do for your kids is let them see you choosing happiness.